We have been stymied by the weather in many ways, with some folks not being able to get here, some folks' flights cancelled and so on. So we are juggling the program as we try to do, to make it happen. And so the panel that was scheduled for 1, we have now shifted it up to now, which is the panel on one man, one vote, voting rights, then and now. And then one of our panelists is Jordan Camp, who is at Columbia in New York. Wrote Shane and myself last night to say he was not able, he got stuck, so he was not able to make it. So we have 2 panelists, and as our usual procedure, they will just introduce themselves, what they do, and then I've said to them that they can talk longer than the 8 minutes that was originally given to them.
Witnesses now. He said it.
So let me just say thanks to both of you for coming, and then do you want to go first, and then please?
Okay. Just intros or
intros, and then go ahead. Yeah.
So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ufot, and I run an organization called the New Georgia Project. Hey, somebody knows that. Very cool. So the New Georgia Project, I was born in Nigeria, raised in Southwest Atlanta, and actually began my career as a labor lawyer, and worked with a number of unions throughout the country, particularly public employee unions. And my friends joked that I had gone into what is called activist retirement because I moved to Canada and worked for unions in Canada. So, I think the difference between the American labor movement and the Canadian labor movement, the struggles are the same. Everyone has to organize against their bosses. But I think that Canadian employers at least recognize the union's right to exist. And so was living in Canada, working in Canada, and back in the day when I was a baby sort of Democratic Party operative who didn't know any better, I met my best friend who was in 2013 working and advising the Georgia Democratic Party, and said, you need to meet this woman, her name is Stacey Abrams. So when you come home for the holidays, you guys, I'm going to arrange for you to have brunch. And I was like, well, I have enough friends. And I only have a couple of days at home, so... thanks for trying to expand the friend circle, but I'm okay. And she was like, no, this is really, really important. You should meet this woman. And I was like, well, it is brunch. And it's free. And I like free brunch. So I will meet with this Stacey Abrams person that you insist. Anyway. Fast forward to New Year's Day in 2013. We have brunch, and she talks about sort of her vision for Georgia and the idea that at the time there were 1 million Black and Latino Georgians in the state who were eligible to vote and unregistered. We started talking about top of the ticket races and Obama's numbers from 2012, et cetera. And it seemed that over the past couple of election cycles that the win margin, the number between the winner and the loser for statewide races across the state of Georgia was 200,000 voters. And it had been 200,000 votes for almost 10 years. And that seems suspicious to me. Anytime people try to quote me a budget number and it ends in a 0, I'm like, that's not a real number. And the idea that there have been 10 major election cycles in Georgia and the top of the ticket winner is always won by 200,000 votes was super suspicious to me. And then the fact that, again, there were 1 million people of color in the state of Georgia who were eligible to vote and unregistered was also very suspicious to me. It also, and so so this is brunch, and I'm drinking, Stacey doesn't drink, so I was automatically suspicious. But we started talking about the New Georgia Project and what her vision was for it. I went back home, I went back to Ontario, I was back in Ottawa. And she called me one day and said, well, how much do you make? And I told her, and she was like, well, we can't afford that, but you need to come home. That we've raised a little bit of money to pay you a salary, and we would like for you to run the New Georgia Project as its executive director. And so I packed up my truck and drove 24 hours from Ottawa back home to Atlanta. Not 24 hours straight, I stopped in DC halfway. And the rest is history. I think that, many people, doing this work in Atlanta is both a privilege and a challenge. Many people sort of refer to it as the American Civil Rights Movement, but we definitely prefer the Southern Freedom Movement, because that is what we still sort of toil towards and labor for. So a couple things about Georgia and why we think the work of the New Georgia Project is really important, and also why we feel like the work of the New Georgia Project is we do work in a particular tradition that is SNCC and CORE and lots of people who, again, we are fortunate enough to hear from in person from time to time. Most of the time it's with love and strategic advice, it's support, sometimes it's criticism. But we are honored to be able to continue this struggle and toil with freedom fighters and veterans of the Southern Freedom Rights Movement. So Georgia is changing. I mean, a lot is being made about the demographic shifts that are happening across the U.S., right? But nowhere are those demographic shifts happening as rapidly and as aggressively as they are in the American South. So in 6 years, 2024, Georgia will be the first state in the Deep South with a white minority. So African Americans, Latinos, and Asian Americans will make up the majority of Georgians by 2024. And that demographic shift is being driven by Black Americans moving from the Midwest and from the coast back to the South. So political scientists and demographers are referring to it as the reversal of the Great Migration, right? So from between the 1920s and the 1970s, Black Americans fled the South, fleeing racialized violence and in search of economic opportunities. And now many people are moving back. I joke all the time that, like, don't move to Atlanta, we're full. But the truth is that it is precisely because of all of these educated Black folks and also Black immigrants from the Caribbean and from Africa that are moving to Atlanta and into Georgia and into the American South that are creating these political and policy opportunities that we are experiencing right now. So 1.5 million people have moved to Georgia in the past decade. Over 80% of them are people of color. And so the demographic shifts in Georgia, they're happening very, very quickly. They are massive. And it is unique. So Arizona is another state that is experiencing its own demographic shift and will also have a white minority in the next 6 to 8 years. But again, unlike Georgia, it is not being driven by Black Americans and Black folks moving to the state. And so we find ourselves in a very unique position Georgia has 159 counties. I bring that up because every county has their own county board of elections, and each sort of county has their own king and queen of elections. And they find that they are all along the ideological spectrum, but many of them are very hostile to the work that we do. And it is not always about ideology. Sometimes it's because we make them work hard and do their jobs. So we've registered 300,000 African Americans and Latinos in the past 4 years in the state of Georgia alone. So we are a third of the way to our goal of closing the gap between unregistered Black Georgians and unregistered. So when we started, there were 1 million African Americans and Latinos and Asian Americans and unmarried women who were eligible to vote and unregistered. To date, we've registered 300,000. So yeah, we're a third of the way to closing that gap and completing our goal. We've almost completely eliminated the racial voter registration gap. So the idea that there was a gap that was determinative by race between unregistered and registered Georgians. So that basically 40% of African Americans in Georgia, eligible African Americans, are unregistered, but eligible but unregistered, and 40% of white Georgians are eligible and unregistered. And there used to be a much, much larger gap between the races for people who were registered to vote, and we've eliminated that. So we're very proud of the work in that particular instance. I also think that Georgia would have elected a Black governor a long time ago. Georgia would have elected a Black United States Senator a long time ago. But for these very, very sophisticated voter suppression schemes that are in place today. And so when I think about the work of the New Georgia Project, and I think about the work that we do, and there's just being reminded of the Black Panthers, and the idea is that it is our responsibility to meet that sophistication with sophistication, right? So the idea that, yes, we've certainly experienced violence at the hand of the state. We had a peaceful protest in the Georgia State Capitol 48 hours ago, where it was the New Georgia Project and Grandmothers for Peace and Southerners on the New Ground and a Latino group that we work with called Mi Gente, that we all went to the Capitol to demand that the new Secretary of State not certify Georgia's elections before every single vote was counted. And the Capitol Police responded in the most violent and aggressive way that one can imagine. We had the grandmothers who were with us were thrown to the ground. Their heads were banged up against the marble floors of the Capitol. We had a sitting state senator, Nikema Williams, who was arrested. And there's a Georgia law that says that during the legislative session, no elected official, no legislator can be arrested for a misdemeanor. And she literally came out of session to inquire about what was going on with the protest and why were the police putting grandmothers and these young kids in zip ties, and they grabbed her and arrested her as well. So, while I'm really, really proud of the work that we've done, Lucy McBath is one of the mothers of the movement. Her son, Jordan Davis, was murdered in Florida for playing his music too loud at a gas station. She won her seat. So she's going to Congress in Georgia's 6th congressional district. And we're really proud of her for that because there was a special election in 2017 in Georgia's 6th congressional district where there was a man, John Ossoff, who ran, a young white guy, charismatic, dynamic, but the point is that it was the most expensive race for Congress in the history of American politics. And Democrats lost because they put up this white moderate guy who they thought would sort of negotiate with Trump voters and negotiate with conservatives, and that black voters would and young voters would just be so incensed and enraged with the Trump administration that they would go along and vote for him. And he lost. And then we ran Lucy McBath, who is an activist and comes out of movement, and with a bold and unapologetic platform about how we move Georgians and Americans from barely surviving to thriving, and she won. And so I say all that to say that, the work of the Southern Freedom Movement has not ended at all, that we are seeing a resurgence in really, really violent responses to basic work that I think is sort of central and essential to our democracy, like voter registration. That the suppression attempts look like they're much more data-centered and data-focused. And so in addition to our aggressive litigation strategy, and in addition to trying to be really smart about our communications work, and telling the story of our movement, that we've also had to become data scientists so that we can track this exact match system that's in place in Georgia where, so my brother has a hyphenated first name, and when he went to register to vote in 2016, the county clerk put in his name without the hyphen, and he was kicked off of the voter rolls and wasn't allowed to vote. Well, they tried to kick him off the voter rolls in 2016, but he has a sister that runs a voting rights organization, and we had a team of attorneys that had to go in and advocate for him to get him added back to the rolls. Most Georgians don't have access to that, and it's a problem. We are looking at probably 2 million eligible Georgians that have been purged from the voter rolls since Brian Kemp was the Secretary of State. And I bring that point up because Brian Kemp, as a Secretary of State, in sort of one of the most blatant abuses of power, refused to resign from his position as he challenged Stacey Abrams for governor. That he literally resigned the Thursday after the election because he wanted to crown himself governor. And so in his own, he declared himself victorious and then declared himself the duly elected governor of Georgia and then resigned. So I say all that to say that that they have reached sort of clown level desperation in terms of the management of our elections, the integrity of our elections. Brian Kemp oversaw, had multiple opportunities to buy new machines in the state of Georgia. The voting machines in Georgia run on Windows 2000 software. Microsoft no longer even provides support for that. The voting machines in Georgia are old enough to vote themselves, and there are videos on YouTube about how to hack Georgia's voting machines. That is public information. There was a sort of a good hacker convention where a 14-year-old kid demonstrated how to hack into Georgia's voting machines in less than 5 minutes. And so that is the work that we're doing. And again, while I'm very proud of the 300,000 people that we've registered to vote, the 500,000 people that we've talked to and moved to the polls, we are also very much in a defensive fight to make sure that every vote gets counted and that this work still continues. I used to, because I have, I'm an immigrant, became a U.S. citizen my senior year in high school. And so I have a lot of friends and families and loved ones who do immigrant rights organizing. There are a lot of people in my life who I love who do sort of just pure racial justice organizing and criminal justice reform work. I used to feel a little like I wasn't doing real movement work because I focused on electoral justice, and that like people who were doing criminal justice work were doing the real work. And I would never like admit this publicly, but it used to be in my head a lot until I realized that these tools of democracy are how we build power, that they are how we build policies, and politics are actually really, really essential to bringing about the future that we want to live in. And so the idea that voter registration, the idea of electoral organizing being sort of a secondary piece to actual liberation, and that it's not real liberation work, is just really, really false. That it's a key and essential part of, again, building the Georgia, building the U.S., building these countries that we want to live in, and like ultimately moving Africans and African descendants of Africa all over the globe, or the African diaspora, from moving from survival to thriving, to pushing back against anti-Black policies and it's just super important. And then I think the last thing I will mention is that, so we've built an app. Because part of it is that what we've realized is that doing a lot of voter registration work, people register people, you get the numbers, you keep your fingers crossed that you hope folks turn out to vote. And we've been doing tons of research, so polling, focus groups with the folks that we've registered to vote, people who showed up to vote and people who didn't show up to vote. And so we have a lot of clarity about why people don't show up to vote, even after they've been registered via one of our voter registration drives. And in addition to all of these sort of systemic barriers that are constructed and put in place, one of the things is that people go to the polls completely unprepared and not confident about who it is that they're going to vote for. So there is, people know who they're going to vote for president, people know who they're going to vote for governor, but when you start to go down the ballot, it becomes less and less clear who these people are and what they stand for. And so I built an app. It's called the New Georgia Project app. It's in the App Store, Apple Store, and in the Google Play Store. And basically, it's a photo and a video, a photo and a brief bio of everyone that is on your ballot. So you put your zip code in, you put your address in, and it pulls up the ballot that you will see on election day. And we have their picture, we have the issue position, so their voting history or their voting record, and then we have all of their donors. So, and it came because we had a campaign this year, 18 by 18, that we were going to register 18,000 18-year-olds in 2018. We ended up registering 20,000, so I'm really proud of that work. But as we continue to organize with these young people, and what happened is at the beginning we were doing very much retail politics. So going to high school principals and saying, hey, can we register voters during your lunch period? Can we register your seniors? And then the Parkland school shooting happened, which I think has really radicalized a lot of young people around politics and voting and voter registration and guns and the Second Amendment and all of that. And so after the Parkland school shooting happened, we got flooded with phone calls from students who wanted to host voter registration drives. But then they wanted to know more about who was running and what they stood for, and someone demanded a list of me, everyone in Georgia who was running on the ballot who had taken money from the NRA, because they wanted to make sure that all of the kids at their schools voted against them, which began this conversation about money and politics, which just led to the development of the app. So if you go into the New Georgia Project app, if you want to figure out who Home Depot, which is a Georgia-based company, or Coca-Cola, which is a Georgia-based company, who they give money to, and the NRA, is there in our app. And so the idea is that, again, as we fight sophisticated voter suppression and sophisticated violence, and just the limitation of Black political participation, we do it with all of the tools that we have available to us, including technology. So I'll stop there.
Great, thank you very much.
How are you funded?
So we basically it's individual donors, and we go to, I'll be honest, there are wealthy people on the left who give money to political candidates because they think that that is the key to bringing about the policies that we need to see. And I go and make the argument that you will always need a left flank, that we need year-round community organizing in order to do this kind of work, in order to hold legislators and politicians accountable. And I even invoke Stacey's name. So like, these are people you want to see a Governor Abrams, but think about the Obama Congress and then put them in overalls and chewing tobacco and remove any sense of accountability. And that is the legislature that a Governor Abrams will have to negotiate with. And so we need to create the conditions and create the demand for a $15 minimum wage, for Medicaid expansion in Georgia, et cetera.
David.
I understand that the Board of Elections in Georgia this afternoon will declare the election results.
That's not exactly clear. They can't do it before 5 p.m. today,
right,
but she may take the weekend. We don't know.
Okay. I understand if she's not declared the winner, she has an option under Georgia law to contest the election result even after the fact. Can you say something about that law and what that means?
Yeah, so there's a Georgia state statute that says essentially that in the face of credible claims of voter suppression, check, or in the face of credible claims of election tampering, check, that the Secretary of State has the discretion to call for a recount if they're petitioned by one of the campaigns, one of the statewide campaigns. So it could be the governor, it could be one of the gubernatorial candidates, it could be one of the candidates for lieutenant governor, any statewide campaign who brings to the Secretary of State credible evidence of voter suppression or election tampering can petition for a recount. Not a runoff, but a recount. So the challenge is that, as I mentioned before, there are 159 counties in Georgia, meaning 159 kings and queens of elections. Several of those counties, about a dozen, certified the results of their election on election night, right? So what that means is that the 4 federal court cases that have happened between today and election night, they certified their elections before they received the guidance from the courts. So everyone, all 159 counties are counting votes differently. They've treated provisional ballots differently. They've treated absentee ballots differently. Many people think Hurricane Michael devastated Southwest Georgia. Many people think that it only hit Florida. But the mail from Albany, Georgia, and like the Southwest Georgia and the lower parts of Georgia's Black Belt are being routed through Tallahassee, Florida, right? So absentee ballots are still coming in, even though they are postmarked by the appropriate deadline. So the guidance that all county board of elections have received is all over the place. There is credible evidence of voter suppression. There's credible evidence of election tampering. And the argument that we made yesterday to the Secretary of State was that this is an opportunity for you to be a hero. Yeah. This is an opportunity for you to communicate clearly to all 159 boards of elections which ballots count and which ballots don't, and then an opportunity, and having offered that guidance, you can then oversee a fair and accurate count. Where everyone is operating from the same playbook, because that has not happened yet. And so yes, we're asking for a recount, but the truth of the matter is that there hasn't been a fair count, period, to begin with. Yeah.
What's a provisional ballot?
Yes, so it's a tool of white supremacy, but it is also, it is given to a voter when they are not found on the voter rolls. So you go to vote, they don't see your name there, and you insist, I'm a voter, I'm a registered voter, I should not have been purged, I don't know what's going on, I don't know why you can't find my name.
I got it, yeah.
But they give you a provisional ballot. And then you have 72 hours after the election to cure whatever the deficiency was that led to you getting a provisional ballot. The problem is that we have evidence that there are thousands of Georgians who were eligible to vote a regular ballot who were given a provisional ballot. And people think that when they're given a provisional ballot that their vote counts, and so they go home and they don't bother with it at all. But the truth is provisional ballots don't count unless you come back within the 72 hours.
Okay.
I'm following the race closely in Florida and also Georgia. I'm so interested in the decision that was made in Palm Beach County, the one county with the votes in Florida that they couldn't certify as of the deadline yesterday. I'm curious, I guess.
Could you speak up? Sorry.
Sure, I'm sorry. I'm speaking to the table. Bad habit of mine. One of the questions that I have is, are there, I guess it's twofold, are there organizations similar to the New Georgia Project that is performing the same incredibly important work that you're doing in Georgia, in Florida, that will protest what is going on and the injustices that have happened time and time again in Palm Beach County? The 2000 election is a very excellent example of that. My second question is, being from Southeast Alabama and knowing these communities in Georgia, what happened in Columbus, Georgia is a telltale indication of the nefarious mechanizations that Kemp and the state of Georgia are using to suppress black voters. I know of that county because I have friends and family who still live there, who were forced to vote on provisional ballots and who didn't understand what that meant, and that not going back after 72 hours was so vital for their vote to count. Thankfully, I called them and let them know that, but some people weren't able to make it before. And so I guess what I'm asking you now is, you're mentioning that the acting Secretary of State of Georgia now has the power to right these wrongs. What is the forecast for Georgia? What is it looking like?
So first, we have a sister organization or an ally, like very close allies in Georgia, in Florida, called the New Florida Majority, and they do very, very good work. Dream Defenders also do really, really good work in Florida. And what the forecast looks like, I think it's important. So a bit of context. So the acting or interim Secretary of State, her name is Robin Crittenden. She is framed as a longtime ally of our current Republican governor, Governor Deal. She's a black woman. She heads up the largest state agency in the state of Georgia, which is like the Georgia version of Health and Human Services. And in our meeting yesterday, it was very, very clear to me that she does not make moves that are not sort of where she doesn't feel like she is strongly supported by the law. It's also important to point out that literally Brian Kemp resigned to declare himself governor, and then they just placed this woman in his place. So she literally has the entire Kemp apparatus that is advising her and supporting her, which is why we insisted on meeting with her personally. We essentially sent a different pastor, a different rabbi into her office every day since the election, or every day since she was appointed, and demanded a meeting. Because the other thing is, through the New Georgia Project app, we have a Problems at the Polls feature. And so we have tons of stories of people who ran into issues on election day, and because of the GPS coordinates, we know exactly what polling location it occurred at. It's time stamped. People who download the app give us their email addresses, and if they want to, they'll give us their phone numbers. So we have all of this data that we are sharing with her today, actually like right now. And so we wait and see. The court order says that that the state cannot certify the election before today at 5 p.m. And the deadline to certify the election is 5 p.m. Tuesday the 20th. And so it could happen as early as 5:01 today, or as late as Tuesday the 20th. I think the other thing when you talk about what's happening on the ground is that the Secretary of State is going to a runoff. And I think that we've made the case why that constitutional office is so important. The challenge with that is that the runoff is scheduled for December 4th. And so it's not clear to us if the governor's race goes to a runoff, if it's going to be on December 4th or on some later date. So it's a mess. One. But two, I also think that that's why there's an opportunity, or why we try to frame it as an opportunity to the new Secretary of State to inject some clarity into the system and to be a grown up, and to not reward, because I think one of the things is people frame or see calling for a recount or a runoff as a benefit to the Abrams campaign. And the truth of the matter is that what we're doing is saying, let's not reward racists. Let's not reward cheaters, right? That they have been able to successfully manipulate the system. They've been able to purge almost 2 million people from the rolls. Even in the last days of the 2018 voter registration deadline, he was able to keep 53,000 people off of the voter rolls. And so by handicapping and working to dismantle Georgia's election system, he's essentially crowned himself king and made himself governor. And so what we're saying is, do not reward that. That there should be some accountability to all of the people of Georgia. And so that probably doesn't answer your question. I guess the real answer is I don't know. I have no idea what's gonna happen. We have literally from 5:01 today until 5 p.m. on Tuesday for there to be a definitive answer about what's happening with the Georgia governor's race.
Thank you.
Maya?
I like Instagram. So I saw the way that celebrities were trying to mobilize and get people to vote for Abrams or other candidates. And so I guess my question is, doing all this work and getting people registered and or to the polls to vote, how do you keep that energy when we don't get the results that we want? And how do we keep them interested or invested in this process?
Yeah. So this is the conversation that I've literally been having with our organizers and volunteers for the past couple of days. And what I've said to them is that it's not about what's happening in the White House, that it's always been about what's happening in your house, right? And that Georgia, the minimum wage in Georgia is $5.15. So it's below the federal minimum wage of $7.25. That we're building 2 new nuclear power plants in Georgia, both in communities of color. And there haven't been any new nuclear power plants built anywhere in the US in 30 years. And the people of Georgia are paying for it through their Georgia Power Bill. So it's a regressive tax at that. But I don't use that language because I try to talk to people in a way that people understand. But I tell people, go and look at your Georgia Power Bill. There's a line, it's called Nuclear Cost Recovery Fee. So literally every citizen who has an electrical bill in Georgia is paying for this nuclear power plant that no one is asking for. And so, there's some people who are motivated by the opportunity to make history. There are some people who are motivated by sort of Stacey as a progressive sort of champion and like real life Black genius. But there are a lot of people who are motivated by the real bread and butter issues, and we have these freedom schools. We refer to them as freedom schools internally. Again, we are very clear that we do this work in a specific tradition. But the proper name is the Advocates for Change Institute. And so we have taken, and these aren't people who go to your NAACP meetings. These are ordinary Georgians who are infrequent voters or people who voted in 2008 and had never voted since. And we have this 5-week community organizing civic engagement boot camp where we talk about all of the things that matter to them and how we go about changing the system, and we work to connect the dots with people. And since we've been doing it since 2015, 90% of the people who graduated from our freedom schools have gone on to vote in every single election that they're eligible to vote in. We have several that are running for office. A lot of people hear about what's happening and the fact that Flint, Michigan still doesn't have clean water. But there are several cities around the state of Georgia that have questionable properties in their water, water that's not safe to drink. And so the graduates from our freedom schools went and heard about Flint, went to the Atlanta Public School Board, demanded that they test all of the water sources in APS schools. We found several schools with unacceptable levels of lead in the water. And to their credit, the APS School Board immediately worked on a plan to remediate that. The same thing with DeKalb County Schools and several other school boards. But the point is that people didn't know what school board members did, right? So the folks who came to our freedom schools had no idea what school board members were responsible for, and that work is happening. And so these conversations are a lot easier because people understand the dots that are connected between elected officials and the change that they want to see, and that it's not the popularity contest that it has been in the past. That we are really trying to elect leaders that are accountable to our communities, and who know what our community's priorities are. And so we're just building more sophisticated, more plugged in voters.
Yeah, great. Can I say thanks very much?
Thank you.
Malcolm?
That's an example of what needs to be done about voter suppression these days. My name's Malcolm Farmer. I'm a corporate lawyer. I'm 79, so I'm a semi-retired corporate lawyer in Providence. I am a perfect model of beneficiary of white privilege. I grew up in a family that sent me to private schools, Yale University, Harvard Law School. Came back to Providence, my current firm, and was walking home one day by the Rhode Island School of Design and noticed a New York Times article on the sidewalk. And it had a picture of a 5-year-old black child holding an American flag and a Mississippi Highway patrolman lifting him off the ground. And the article described how he had been thrown in a paddy wagon and driven to the Mississippi State Fairgrounds, which was being used as a prison because there were so many people being arrested for demonstrating in Jackson. And he was bailed out by a guy named Al Bronstein from the Lawyers Constitutional Defense Committee. So anyway, I had not been involved in civil rights, but that picture just really pissed me off, so I decided I should do something about it, and I started volunteering at the Corps office in Camp Street, and I felt very rewarded by what I was doing and helping people, and I figured that there were very few black lawyers in Mississippi, which is true, so I started to find a way to volunteer, and eventually found the Lawyers Constitutional Defense Committee, which took volunteers, lawyers, to help out on civil rights matters in the South. My law firm thought it was a worthwhile thing for me to do. I spent a month in Monroe, Louisiana, hung out with James Farmer, who, believe it or not, was not related to me. But I was incredibly fulfilled by the first lawsuit I ever filed, enjoined a school bond issue in this parish because it was going to fund segregated schools. In any event, I was 25 years old, single, it was very heady, and I told them if they could pay my living expenses, I'd quit my job and come back. And that happened that fall, much to my family's disowning me, dismay. I destroyed my legal career. In any event, I went to Jackson and spent 2 years as a staff counsel at LCDC, mostly in Mississippi and to some extent in Louisiana and Selma. LCDC was formed in 1964 as an organization to provide no-cost legal services to people fighting for equality of justice and other constitutional rights, otherwise known as the Civil Rights Movement. The primary organizing entities of LCDC were the ACLU, National Council of Churches and Other Religious Organizations, SNCC, CORE, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And the motivating reason for its creation was the anticipated enormous increase in the need for civil rights legal services in the summer of 1964 due to the anticipated effort to provide assistance to local blacks in seeking civil rights. Combined with a very small number of black lawyers in the Deep South, and the fact that white lawyers and the governments of Mississippi, Louisiana, and Alabama realized that they couldn't convict anybody of crimes without providing legal counsel. White lawyers didn't want anything to do with representing defendants in criminal charges for civil rights activities. And so there was an unwritten agreement by the state bar associations that out-of-state lawyers could practice in the Deep South as long as they did so without charging any cost to anyone and limited what they were doing to civil rights legal support. Notwithstanding that, of course, some of us got arrested for unauthorized practice of law from time to time, but what we ended up doing, we had a staff of like 3, maybe as many as 5 in offices in Selma, Shreveport, but the primary one in Jackson on North Farish Street. There was so much work that 3 staff lawyers had to depend on volunteer lawyers coming down to help. We had, in the quarter ending September 1965, 3 people handled 125 active court suits and closed 88 cases. And in 66, in the same period of 3 months, we had 178 active court cases and closed 62. So a gigantic portion of what we did was criminal defense work on behalf of people engaged in voter registration activities or efforts to register themselves, and we defended criminal prosecutions against them for basically exercising First Amendment rights, demonstrating integrating, public facilities, all the things that the civil rights movement included. We also brought affirmative actions to desegregate schools and public institutions. We challenged employment discrimination, joined with the Deacons for Defense and Justice, who we represented, and they ended up stopping the Klan movement in Bogues in a shootout. So much for the nonviolence of the civil rights movement. But they also reversed the seniority rules at Crime Zellabach. We brought lots of litigation to void unconstitutional statutes, voter restrictions laws. We sued police and other law enforcement agencies and their surety companies for brutality against civil rights workers and local blacks. We brought post-conviction actions all the time because juries were segregated when people were convicted, because jurors were selected from the voting list and blacks weren't registered to vote. The civil rights movement itself, I think the portion that was devoted to trying to achieve economic opportunity for local blacks has been understated. We did a lot of community and co-op organization, helping them found a brick-making factory, a host of economic development things, and then extensive political work because we represented the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, and they were both a political party and a civil rights organization, as everybody knows, who had a host of issues with the political system, and then represented people who were discriminated against by federal programs like the Veterans Administration, Social Security, Farm Aid. Our lawyers were exposed to violence, although our mission was to remain in the background, so to try not to highlight that. And I actually did discover for the first time a disadvantage of white privilege, which was that if you were a civil rights lawyer and you were white and you got busted, you got sent to the white section of jail. In my case, that led to all the cell doors being unlocked and the jailer saying he'd be gone at sundown. The inmates could do whatever they wanted with me. So I got bailed out, which was fortunate. The voting rights activities were a consistent source of criminal defense work. And the success of the voter suppression activities of literacy tests, poll taxes, and violence reflected by the fact that in 1868, during Reconstruction, 97% of blacks in Mississippi were registered to vote, and in 1964, that percentage was less than 7%. So our role, and I think the most important credit for whatever success the movement achieved, was to support the unbelievable courage and perseverance of local blacks who were in Mississippi subjected to all of the economic, physical prejudice and violence that one could imagine, and kept coming back over and over again, asserting their humanity in particular, but also their rights as citizens of the United States. So we were providing assistance necessitated by the fact that the system of racial segregation was built on a huge structure of law after law after law being passed by the Mississippi legislature to restrict constitutional rights and exercise by local blacks. And I think that the activities of organizations like the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, SNCC, and CORE are basically models of what we just heard about in Georgia as part of what's required to battle successfully against today's voter suppression activities, which saw a significant increase in 2013 after Justice Roberts' opinion in Shelby County against Holder, which emasculated the 1965 Voting Rights Act. The same kind of gerrymandering that occurred after the 2010 midterm elections when Republicans took control of state houses. It was reflected in Mississippi. We handled a case called Connor v. Johnson. It was throughout the entire redistricting of congressional and state districts. But the fact that every time we won a victory of that kind, more statutes would get enacted that would further expand techniques of voter suppression. So today, when you see something like in, say, North Dakota, where a law is passed that's saying you've got to have a street address in order to register to vote, and you disenfranchise Native Americans who live on reservations, while they have a post office box, is the activities of the Georgia Secretary of State are as corrupt as the kind of things we saw in Mississippi in the 60s. Notwithstanding those efforts, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which I think was passed kind of Bloody Sunday and other demonstrations of violence in the Deep South, increased registration, voter registration with Mississippi blacks up over 60%, and was immediately succeeded by the enactment of a host of laws by the Mississippi legislature to making it extremely difficult for blacks to actually get elected to office by creating at-large districts, converting the black belt into three sort of bulbs of voters districts, which were referred to as three pigs in a trough by most blacks at that time. That was not overturned until the early 70s, and in the late 60s, Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party succeeded in getting the United States Supreme Court to invalidate a whole range of discriminatory statutes that had been passed in response to the Voting Rights Act of 65. So by 1972, there were 2/3 of blacks were registered in Mississippi. Elected officials throughout state government at all levels, so we're only 2.7% black. Today, when we look at voter suppression activities, which I think are absolutely having the same effect as a poll tax and literacy tests were used in the history of the Deep South, we were assisted by, for the most part, by federal courts, particularly the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals in New Orleans, which was composed of white Southerners on the court, was a source of tremendous support for civil rights, because we were losing cases all the time before lower state courts. We removed them to federal court and then appeal to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals and win. And we won over and over and over again in that federal court. Well, today, given the appointments by the White House and Republican-controlled Senate, we're not going to have the support of the courts to anywhere near the extent we had in the 60s. As a result, broad-based political activity and organization, the kind we just heard about in Georgia, is a critically important part of necessary political response to what's going on as far as voter suppression is concerned. And again, the provision of legal support of those efforts, which we are also seeing today throughout the country, is critically important, because voter suppression activities or laws are passed by legislatures that are primarily controlled in Republican states, and they need to be defeated legally in the court system. So who's doing that? It's the same organizations, the ACLU and AACP Legal Defense Fund, Southern Poverty Law Center. Common Cause is active today in bringing actions challenging voter suppression. I think that in the face of the obstacles, like the inability to rely effectively on the federal judiciary, at least until once appointments are done through 2020, there are encouraging signs of mobilization in response to the Trump administration and activities that they've been propagating. I think, in general, the picture is very mixed under the current landscape. We just saw the Democrats flip 7 governorships and 8 legislative houses in midterm elections, which is important because in 2020 there's a census, and then redistricting in 2021, and who controls those state houses is going to control how the lines get drawn. So I believe that the movement in the 60s, and particularly the activities of, and I know Charlie Cobb pretty well, and he spent 5 years in the Delta as a community organizer. Anybody can last that long doing that is like an American hero. But I think that what we've seen that's succeeded in terms of organizing voters is respect for local leadership, listening to what the needs of local people are, not just coming in and dictating or telling people what they have to do. It's got to be much more responsive and kind of a communal activity. Contrary to what people are saying, 38% of the people who voted in the midterms were between the ages of 18 and 29, which belies the idea that young people don't care and won't vote. And 28% were minorities, which I think was maybe the highest ever in the midterm election. So I think there are positive signs of organized response and people being concerned about the kind of not only voter suppression but racism that's still probably America's most significant problem and far from being remedied. So my conclusion is that it's mixed. It was mixed in the 60s too, but mixed in the wrong direction. Thank you.
Comments, questions? Yes, Julie.
Just as a SNCC person, I know Cortland and I both agree, LCDC was primo. I mean, you all were amazing in Mississippi. And wasn't Lynn Holt part of LCDC? No.
Were they the lawyers' defense?
Yeah, he's talking about LCDC. Wasn't Lynn Holt part of your group? Black lawyer? No. Anyway, you are on our site because LCDC is one of the major organizations that help get us out of jail and do all that voting rights legislation. So thank you very much for that. I think I was going to say something else, but I got caught up. Yeah, okay.
So Cortland, in 1966, were you on the continuation of the Meredith March?
No.
No.
No, I had done my marches by then.
Probably wise. Yeah, because I remember bailing Stokely out, and that was when he first in
He just got elected.
He said Black Power because Willie Ricks had started it, but then Stokely really took it as far as he could in that talk after the march in Canton.
Did you have a relationship with Tougaloo when you were down there?
I did.
Can you tell us about that?
I dated somebody from Tougaloo. Yeah, I did because the Faines from Providence were very involved in Tougaloo, and I met them when I was there, and because I knew people at Brown and Brown's association with Tougaloo, Tougaloo is kind of like a refuge of sort of enlightenment in Jackson area, and you could actually go there and hang out and speak freely about what you thought about it. There were a lot of black kids who were really active in the movement with us, particularly in Jackson. And then there was a good deal of pressure on Tougaloo, but people forget about the fact that Jackson State and all-black college was rigidly conservative in how the students were treated and if they were activists, at least at the time that I was there. So, you know, it was kind of mixed, but we did a bunch of stuff, particularly students' free speech rights became an issue as well, as it inevitably would.
Well, I know the history here with Brown and Tougaloo has been very important. And Charlie Baldwin and Levi Adams were very much part of that. Charlie even was acting president of Tougaloo for a short period of time during transitions.
Yeah, I knew both of them very well.
Yeah, good colleagues.
Hi, how did your experience with LCDC shape your later work or your life?
Well, it changed my life. I mean, what happens when I think you do something like I did, which was incredibly out of my usual domain, that's for sure. And the question I'm asked most often is, how could somebody like you ever end up in Mississippi doing what you're doing? And I gave you the answer. I don't really know why. I was a Brooklyn Dodgers fan when I was 7 years old because I thought it was unfair that Jackie Robinson couldn't play pro ball when they played him. I became, I came back to Rhode Island to run the Governor's Crime Commission under Governor Chafee, who I was close to. My father was very right-wing Republican, and so he was already pissed off at me because I'd done what I did. And if I'd come back as a Democrat, and I was very involved with the Freedom Democratic Party, I think he would have had a heart attack. So I ran for the Providence City Council as a Republican and won, and was on the council for 12 years where I introduced and fought for gay rights legislation. I ended city investments in companies that did business in South Africa. I had the longest standing battle on redistricting because there were extensive efforts to reduce minority representation. Anyway, the whole thing just continued, and I stayed with those causes. And today, I speak. Unfortunately, I'm not asked in public schools, but in charter schools and independent schools, I speak about the movement and racism. And I've endowed a program at the high school, prep school I went to, the Community and Equity Affairs, which is an extraordinary. Those schools have a lot of money, and they do, when they put their mind to it, they really do an incredible job on teaching kids about identity and gay rights and diversity of people from all different countries and everything. So I'm deeply involved in them. Anyway, it changed everything. My kids are just like me, whether they want to be or not.
I would want to say publicly what she doesn't say is that Mr. Farmer is actually a very important friend of the center. And one of the projects that we do with community organization is actually part a result of his the way in which he expresses his friendship to the center, let me put it that way.
Yes, I'm impressed with Hope High School and what you're doing.
Okay, good. Thank you all very, very much. There's a lunch break and then we come back.